She was supposed to be invisible. Just another face in the crowd, serving champagne and keeping her head down. But when the bride's heel connected with her pregnant stomach in front of 200 guests, the screams didn't just fill the garden, they shattered a secret that would bring an entire community to its knees. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty exposed a web of lies so thick, even the people living them didn't see it coming. The Johnson wedding was meant to be the event of the year in Riverside, a quiet suburb just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. For 6 months, the town had watched the preparations unfold. Victoria Johnson, daughter of the town's wealthiest real estate developer, was marrying Marcus Webb, a charming architect whose smile could light up a room and whose reputation was spotless. The venue was the historic Riverside Manor, with its sprawling gardens and fountains that looked like they belonged in a European castle, white roses everywhere, a string quartet, champagne towers that cost more than most people's cars. Everyone who was anyone had been invited, and those who weren't spent weeks complaining about it. But among the hired staff, barely noticed by the guests sipping cocktails and admiring the floral arrangements, was a young woman named Sarah. 23 years old, 6 months pregnant, and working her 3rd catering job that week, just to keep the lights on in her tiny studio apartment. She wore the standard black and white uniform, her hair pulled back tight, her swollen feet already aching 2 hours before the ceremony even started. Nobody looked at her twice, nobody knew her name, and that was exactly how it was supposed to be. But by sunset, her face would be on every phone screen in town, and her name would become the center of a scandal that would tear families apart and force an entire community to confront the ugliest parts of themselves. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened that day, you need to understand who these women were and how their lives had become tangled in ways neither of them fully realized. Victoria had grown up with everything: private schools, summer homes, a trust fund that guaranteed she'd never struggle. She was beautiful in that polished magazine cover way, with perfect teeth and hair that always looked professionally styled even when she claimed she'd just woken up. But beneath the surface, Victoria carried a deep insecurity that money couldn't fix. She needed to be the center of attention, needed to be envied, needed everyone to see her as the woman who had it all. Marcus was her prize, her proof that she'd won at life. Sarah's story was different. She'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until she aged out of the system at 18, with nothing but a high school diploma and a fierce determination not to end up homeless. She'd worked fast food, cleaned houses, done whatever it took to survive. When she got pregnant, the father had disappeared before she even told him, leaving her alone and terrified but somehow still hopeful that she could give her child a better life than she'd had. She picked up catering jobs because they paid cash and didn't ask too many questions. The Johnson wedding was supposed to be easy money: show up, serve drinks, stay quiet, go home. She had no idea that Marcus Webb was someone she'd met before. 6 months earlier, Sarah had been working at a downtown coffee shop when a man in an expensive suit had struck up a conversation with her during her break. He was charming, attentive, asked about her dreams. They'd talked for hours that day and met up twice more over the following weeks. He said his name was Mark and that he was in town temporarily for work. He never mentioned he was engaged. He never mentioned he lived in Riverside. And when Sarah discovered she was pregnant and tried to reach the number he'd given her, it was disconnected. She'd spent months trying to forget him, trying to move forward, trying to prepare for single motherhood. She never expected to see him again. Certainly not at the altar, marrying the richest woman in town. The ceremony was flawless. Victoria floated down the aisle like something out of a fairy tale, and Marcus looked at her with what everyone assumed was love, but might have been relief that he'd made it this far without getting caught. The vows were read, the rings exchanged, and 200 people applauded as Mr. and Mrs. Webb kissed under an arch of white roses. Sarah had been assigned to the cocktail hour, carrying trays of champagne through the crowd of guests who treated her like furniture. She kept her head down, focused on not dropping anything, on getting through the shift without her feet giving out completely. She didn't see Marcus until he was standing right in front of her, reaching for a glass from her tray. Their eyes met. His face went white. She saw the recognition hit him like a physical blow, saw him glance quickly at her stomach and then back at her face. For 3 seconds, that felt like an eternity. They just stared at each other while the party swirled around them. Then he took the glass, his hand shaking slightly, and walked away without a word. Sarah's heart was hammering so hard she thought she might pass out right there. This couldn't be happening. Mark from the coffee shop was Marcus Webb, the groom, the man whose child she was carrying, and he'd just married someone else. She spent the next hour in a daze, mechanically doing her job while her mind raced. Should she say something? Should she leave? What was she supposed to do with this information that felt like a grenade in her chest? She decided to stay quiet. This wasn't her world. These weren't her people. She would finish her shift, take her pay, and never think about Marcus Webb again. But Victoria had seen that moment. She'd been watching her new husband from across the garden, glowing with the satisfaction of being the center of attention when she noticed him freeze mid-conversation. She followed his gaze to a pregnant server and saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. Fear, guilt, recognition. Victoria's mind started working fast. She didn't know who this girl was, but she knew that look. She'd seen it before when she'd caught Marcus in small lies, tiny inconsistencies in his stories that he'd always explained away. She'd ignored her doubts because she wanted the wedding, wanted the life, wanted the Instagram photos and the envy of her friends. But now, watching him watch this pregnant stranger, all those buried suspicions came flooding back. The reception moved into full swing. Dinner was served, toasts were made, and the dance floor filled with guests who'd had just enough champagne to lose their inhibitions. Sarah was clearing plates from empty tables when she felt a hand grip her arm. She turned to find Victoria standing there, her perfect makeup starting to crack around the edges, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Can I help you with something, ma'am?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Victoria leaned in close, her breath wine sweet and angry. "Who are you to him?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "I don't know what you mean. I'm just working the event." "Don't lie to me. I saw how he looked at you. I saw your belly." Victoria's voice was rising now, loud enough that nearby guests were starting to turn and stare. "So, tell me, who are you?" Sarah pulled her arm free, her own anger starting to build. "I don't owe you an explanation. I'm doing my job. You need to let me work." But Victoria was past reason. All the pressure of the perfect wedding, all the years of insecurity, all the rage at the possibility that her husband had betrayed her, it all came erupting out in that moment. She grabbed Sarah's uniform and shoved her backward. "You're nothing. You're nobody. Get out of here." Sarah stumbled, trying to catch her balance, but her swollen belly threw her center of gravity off. She reached for a chair but missed. And then Victoria, in a moment of pure fury that she would regret for the rest of her life, kicked out at the girl who represented everything threatening her perfect world. Her heel connected with Sarah's stomach. Sarah screamed and went down hard, clutching her belly, curling into herself as pain exploded through her abdomen. The music stopped. Every conversation died. 200 people stood frozen, staring at the bride standing over a pregnant woman who was sobbing on the floor. Marcus came running from across the garden, his face a mask of horror. "Sarah! Oh God, Sarah!" He dropped to his knees beside her, and in doing so, confirmed everything. He knew her name. He knew her. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Victoria stood there, her hand over her mouth, suddenly understanding what she'd done, but unable to process it. Someone called 911. Someone else started filming. And as Sarah was lifted onto a stretcher, still conscious but terrified for her baby, she looked up at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "You said your name was Mark. You said you were single. You never told me." Marcus couldn't speak. He just stood there, his wedding suit suddenly feeling like a costume, his carefully constructed life collapsing in real time. Sarah spent 3 days in the hospital. The baby was okay, miraculously, though the doctors warned her she'd need to be on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. She had bruised ribs and a sprained wrist from the fall, and emotional trauma that would take much longer to heal. But physically, she would recover. Victoria's life, however, imploded immediately. The video of her kicking a pregnant woman went viral within hours. Her father's business was flooded with angry calls and protest threats. Her friends stopped answering her messages. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly the Johnson wedding wasn't a celebration, it was a scandal. She tried to explain that she'd been provoked, that she hadn't known about the pregnancy, that it was a moment of insanity. But the video didn't care about context. It just showed a bride in a $10,000 dress assaulting a woman who was clearly pregnant and clearly defenseless. Marcus moved into a hotel the night of the wedding. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters and friends and family all demanding answers. He hired a lawyer. He released a statement admitting to a brief relationship with Sarah months before his wedding, but claiming he hadn't known about the pregnancy. It was technically true, but it sounded like an excuse, and the court of public opinion wasn't buying it. The truth was messier than any statement could capture. Marcus had met Sarah during a moment when he and Victoria had briefly broken up, one of their periodic dramatic splits that usually ended with expensive apology gifts and reconciliation. He'd used a fake name because he didn't want anyone in his social circle finding out he was dating a barista. When Victoria took him back, and he realized how serious she was about getting married, he'd cut off contact with Sarah completely, telling himself it had just been a fling that didn't matter. He genuinely hadn't known she was pregnant. But that didn't make him innocent. It made him a coward who'd treated a vulnerable woman like she was disposable and then tried to pretend she'd never existed. Sarah had every right to be angry, every right to sue, to demand child support, to drag both Marcus and Victoria through the courts and the media until they paid for what they'd done. Her friends urged her to get a lawyer. Strangers on social media, who'd somehow tracked her down, sent messages encouraging her to take them for everything they had. But as she lay in that hospital bed, her hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick despite everything, Sarah realized something that surprised her. She didn't want revenge. She was exhausted from years of fighting just to survive, from always being the underdog, from carrying anger that had never made anything better. She thought about what kind of mother she wanted to be, what kind of example she wanted to set, and she realized that if she spent the next year destroying Marcus and Victoria, she'd be destroying herself too. So she made a choice that shocked everyone. She reached out through her public defender and asked for a meeting with them. No lawyers, no cameras, just the three of them in a conference room at the hospital. Marcus came first, alone, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He sat across from her and started to apologize, but she held up her hand. "I don't need your apologies, Marcus. Or Mark, or whatever your real name is. I need you to understand something. This baby, she's mine. I'm going to raise her, and I'm going to love her, and I don't need anything from you except to be left alone. But if you want to be part of her life, actually be a father and not just write checks to make yourself feel better, then we can figure that out later. Right now, I just need you to stop treating me like I'm a problem that needs to be solved." Marcus broke down. He cried harder than he'd cried since he was a child, all the guilt and shame and self-hatred pouring out. Sarah didn't comfort him. She just waited until he was done and then asked him to leave. The meeting with Victoria was harder. When the woman walked in, Sarah saw someone who looked completely broken. The arrogance was gone, replaced by raw shame and fear. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Victoria said immediately, her voice shaking. "What I did was unforgivable. I was angry and jealous, and I took it out on you, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Sarah studied her for a long moment. Then she said something that would change everything. "I forgive you." Victoria stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "What?" "I forgive you," Sarah repeated. "Not because you deserve it. Maybe you don't. But because I can't carry this hatred around with me. I can't raise my daughter in that kind of darkness. So I'm choosing to let it go. It doesn't mean what you did was okay. It doesn't mean we're friends. But I'm not going to spend my life being the victim of your worst moment." Victoria sobbed. She tried to say thank you, but couldn't get the words out. Sarah let her cry, understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is witness someone's grief without trying to fix it. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Victoria, who'd grown up having everything handed to her, found herself stripped of the identity she'd built her life around. She wasn't the perfect bride anymore. She wasn't the envied wife. She was the villain in a story that had gone viral, and no amount of money or explanations could change that. For the first time in her life, she had to face real consequences. Her marriage to Marcus was annulled within a month. She moved out of her parents' house because she couldn't stand the disappointment in their eyes. She got a job, an actual job, working at a nonprofit that helped domestic violence survivors because she wanted to do something that mattered instead of just existing as someone's daughter. It was humbling and hard, and nothing like the life she'd imagined. But slowly, painfully, she started to become someone real. She reached out to Sarah a few months later with a proposal. "I want to help," she said. "Not because I think it erases what I did, but because I need to do something good. Let me set up a fund for your daughter's future. Let me use my family's connections to help other women who are struggling the way you are." Sarah was skeptical at first, but she saw something genuine in Victoria's eyes, so she agreed, with conditions. The fund would be managed by a third party, and Victoria wouldn't use it for publicity or credit. It would just be a quiet act of restitution. Victoria agreed immediately. Sarah's daughter was born healthy in March, a beautiful girl she named Hope, because that's what she represented, a chance at something better. Marcus did step up eventually. It took him months of therapy and hard conversations, but he became a real presence in Hope's life. Not the father Sarah would have chosen, but a decent man trying to be better than he'd been. He and Sarah would never be together, but they learned to co-parent with respect and honesty. Victoria created the Hope Foundation, named after Sarah's daughter, which provided housing assistance and job training for single mothers. She poured her energy and her family's money into it, not as penance, but as purpose. She and Sarah weren't friends exactly, but they developed a mutual respect. They'd both been changed by that terrible day, carved into different shapes by the same trauma. The video of the incident never fully disappeared from the internet. That's not how the internet works. But over time, as the full story emerged, as people learned about the reconciliation and the redemption, it became less about the violence and more about what came after. It became a story about how the worst moments don't have to define us, how forgiveness isn't about forgetting, but about choosing not to let hatred win. A year after the wedding that never was, Sarah and Hope were living in a modest apartment that Victoria's foundation had helped her secure. Sarah had gone back to school, studying to become a social worker, determined to help other women who'd been where she was. She thought about that day sometimes, the pain and the fear and the humiliation. But she also thought about the choice she'd made afterward, to forgive instead of destroy. It hadn't been easy. Some days she still felt angry. Some days she wondered if she'd let Victoria off too easily. But then she'd look at Hope, growing strong and happy, and she'd remember why she'd done it. Not for Victoria, but for herself. Because the person she wanted to be, the mother she wanted Hope to see, wasn't someone consumed by revenge. It was someone who could take the broken pieces of her life and build something beautiful. Here's what I want you to think about. If you were Sarah, lying in that hospital bed, knowing your child had almost died because of someone's moment of rage, could you have forgiven? Could you have looked past your pain and chosen mercy? And if you were Victoria, raised in privilege, taught that you were special and deserving, could you have faced your worst self and actually changed? Because that's the real question this story asks us. Not whether people deserve forgiveness, but whether we're strong enough to give it. Not whether people can change, but whether we're brave enough to let them. Sarah could have destroyed Victoria. She had the video, the sympathy, the legal right. She could have taken everything, and no one would have blamed her. Instead, she chose a harder path. She chose to break the cycle of pain by refusing to pass it on. And Victoria, who could have hired lawyers and PR firms to rebuild her image while learning nothing, chose instead to actually be different, to use her privilege not to escape consequences, but to create something good from her shame. Neither of them is perfect. This isn't a fairy tale where everyone lives happily ever after. They both still carry scars from that day, and they probably always will. But they're both living proof that our worst moments don't have to be our last chapters, that we can choose who we become after we fall. So I'll ask you again, could you have forgiven? Could you have changed? And maybe more importantly, when was the last time you offered someone else the same grace that Sarah showed Victoria? Because we all mess up. We all have moments we're not proud of. And the world would be a fundamentally different place if we approached those moments with the same courage these two women showed. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you think Sarah was right to forgive, or if Victoria really deserved a second chance. And tell me about a time someone forgave you when they didn't have to, or a time you chose mercy over revenge. Because these conversations, these honest reflections on our shared humanity, that's how we actually learn. That's how we grow. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something real, then share it. Not for views or likes, but because someone you know might need to hear that forgiveness is possible, that change is real, that their mistakes don't have to be their identity. And stay tuned, because next time we're going to explore another story that will challenge everything you think you know about judgment and redemption. Until then, remember that the strongest thing you can do isn't always fighting back. Sometimes it's choosing peace when you have every right to choose war.